Hi friends, you're listening to the Shattered Ceilings podcast with your hosts Stephanie and Adriana. We're here to discuss the importance of mental health from the perspective of two first-generation immigrants. Join in weekly as we dive into important topics such as relationships, parenting, and cultural barriers. Here, we get real and candid as we explore what disrupting the status quo looks like for each of us.
Hi friends, welcome back to season 2, episode 1 of Shattered Ceilings podcast. We are so excited to have you guys back. We missed you. Yeah, we're back. It was a very short summer. I feel like 2 months flew by and I'm like, what did I even do?
Well, I also feel bad. The kids are back in school and it's still like 110 degrees. And I'm like...
Yeah, it still feels like summer.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't do anything this summer. We didn't go anywhere. I don't know if anyone else can relate. It was kind of new for us. Usually we try to travel in the summer. It was good. We spent time with the kids.
You guys went up north a few times? Once?
Literally 2 days. It was
okay.
It was mainly just, I feel like, keeping the kids busy.
Yeah.
That was literally my life this summer.
Oh, well, I feel like this summer we went to Florida for like a week. We did a few up north trips.
Oh, that's nice.
But last summer, I didn't realize how lucky we were gone for 2 months in Europe. So I feel like we missed the heat.
Yeah.
Not missed it. Like we just, obviously weren't here for it. So this summer I was like, is it always this hot? And then everyone's like, well, you're also pregnant. And I'm like, I'm over it.
Yeah.
I want like fall feels and sweaters and sweats. And
I agree. I'm opening my AC lower because I want to feel like it's fall. So we're in a new space. If you guys are watching on video, obviously this is a new setting.
Mm-hmm.
We usually were recording at Adriana's house, but it's going to be baby boy's nursery.
Yeah.
So we are
bittersweet.
Yeah. I can't believe it.
I know.
It's how many more weeks until you're due?
Not a few. I'm due end of next month. So
okay,
we'll
next
see.
month sounds so quick when you say it like that.
It is quick.
That's so crazy. Oh my gosh.
I know.
So we are in a new place. This is my husband's showroom. It's in
process.
We're in progress. Yeah, we have a couple things we want to change, but we're going to be here for the rest of the season.
Mm-hmm.
Fingers crossed, no more.
No, this looks good.
Changes. Yeah. So today we're actually going to talk about something really interesting. Do you want to introduce it, Adriana?
Yes, the title of today's episode is Enmeshment in Immigrant Families. I'm excited to talk about this because I remember when I was in therapy, my therapist brought up so your family, they deal with enmeshment. And I was like, what is that? And she described it to me and I was like, yes, this is... Our family deals with it. I think a lot of immigrant families deal with it.
Yes.
I know we're going to talk about it later, but there's obviously a different, it can become toxic and extreme.
And I think this is going to really kind of hit the nail on the head for a lot of the viewers, especially growing up in immigrant families. I feel like this is a label that you can put over a lot of immigrant families is just the word enmeshment. So we're going to kind of dive into it, talk about personal examples. Enmeshment to me is kind of like intricate patterns in a carpet that you can't really separate from each other. And it's basically when family roles and boundaries become so intertwined that it can be really hard to distinguish where one person ends and another person in the family begins.
It's a group mindset rather than people being individual coming together.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember explaining that to my therapist and she was explaining it's everyone's the same. Everyone has to do the same thing. And if you are individual and you want to do your own thing, then you're the black sheep. And I'm like, yes, I'm the black sheep.
Yeah.
And I really wasn't the black sheep. I just was that person where I was like, no, especially God gives you your own personality, your own desires. And nothing's wrong with being close with the family, but also doing your own thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I had the issue where I felt like I was doing something wrong because I wanted something different.
And I think the main word in this topic and in this episode is going to be being your own individual. Some people, they just have these personalities where they like to push back more. I know my daughter's like that for sure.
You're right.
Yeah. So just for those people that felt like that growing up, I think we all at one time or another felt like that. In immigrant families.
Especially when you're a teenager, you're trying to figure out who you are. Another thing I dealt with was creating my identity, figuring out my identity. And it was hard growing up, not only in a religious setting, but also in that culture setting where like, we are Romanian. This is how we are. This is like the path to life, and
Also
not like
in a
no
bigger
questions.
family, right?
Bigger
Like
family.
you have that label. Oh, you're from the big family. Like,
yeah. And there's 14 of us, but I'm telling you, we have the same parents. And we're all so different. I look at my family and I'm like, it's so cool that we're all so different, but that just shows you can't treat every kid the same. And you can't treat every like person in a culture the same. Like we're all so different.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I also think that a lot of times cultural values play like a huge role. I think about a lot about how immigrant families tend to hold on to their heritage really tightly. We've talked about this before, how our parents came here, were first gen born here, and they didn't want to kind of lose their culture or who they were, so they clung really tightly to that and kind of put us in this box.
They definitely sheltered us.
Yes.
And I know they meant well and they had good intentions because they wanted to like preserve that culture, but we also were the ones being sent to school and being in the American society where, again, we talked about it earlier, we like felt like outcasts. We didn't feel like we belonged.
Yeah, and I think that's where enmeshment is just kind of the extreme version of that. And it kind of just leads to this super intense bond in a family that can make it really difficult for family members to explore their individual identities, like you mentioned. And I know some people may think that this is an exaggeration, that we're talking about this like, oh, like you're trying to find yourself. It's not about that. It's literally, and we'll go into it psychologically, about how each child needs to go through a process of individualization where they figure out who they are. And eventually, especially into adulthood, you kind of have to break away a little bit from what everybody else is.
And I know that's, at least for maybe older people listening, you don't want to hear that. Because I know when I was younger, the Bible does say, like, train up your child. But, I mean, obviously I'm going to like have a kid soon, and I'm so excited. It's a gift from God. But ultimately, our kids aren't ours. You know? It's like we do our best, and when they become adults, as sad as it's gonna be, I can't even think about that, they're God's, and it's like you just have to trust that you did the best job, and like you have to let go. So I think that's where it becomes toxic, and where parents manipulate kids and they isolate them, and they just, again, they don't know who they are. And I dealt with that. Like, what's my identity? Who am I? And that sucks, dealing with all of that as a teenager, let alone the normal things teenagers deal with.
Yeah, I agree. Also, the term enmeshment can describe family relationships a lot of times that lack boundaries. So, for example, parents can be overly or inappropriately reliant on their children for support. This can look like if your parents didn't have a good relationship with their spouse, a lot of times they come to you as the child and use you as like their emotional support, and that's like a very heavy burden to carry as a child, and that's not good, and it should not happen. Developmentally, it's very toxic.
That's not your burden to carry as a child, or even as like a young adult in home. I think we can be there for our parents, but there should be a line, and I think that's when you can tell your parent, well, I don't think you can just tell your parents to go to therapy. But I think it's healthy. That's when you kind of realize too, at least with immigrants, I think marriages are so interesting. Like when you start observing like older marriages, where it's like, yes, they're closer with each other 24/7, but are they not emotionally close where they can rely on each other? And I've seen that too, where the parent relies on a kid and just therapy sessions, venting, like, thank you so much for being there for me. And it's not healthy. I think in the moment it's like, wow, I'm so happy my parents are close.
We're so close, But
then you realize that's really not a healthy relationship to have. That's like...
And another thing is you make it as the parent harder on yourself because you're prolonging that time of detachment that needs to take place. So, for example, for me, being my mother's only child, and I'm a girl, so she was very like open with me about certain things. And then when I got married, it was like so hard for her to understand. And I've talked about this with her before. You can't just come over whenever you want. Like,
you can't.
It's not just my house now. You can't just call 50 times a day because now I have a life. Like I have a job, I have kids, and if I don't pick up, she gets upset. And for her, that was like difficult. And until I had to sit down, and we've talked about boundaries before, and be like,
Mm-hmm.
Mom, I love you, but I'm an adult now.
You have
You
your own
need to
family.
respect, yes, you please need to respect my boundaries. I want to continue to have a relationship with you, but a better relationship, not
Mhm.
one that's codependent. Because enmeshment, and we'll talk about that a lot, can lead to codependency.
Yeah. And I wanted to kind of talk about the whole like parent and kid when you get married. Thankfully, my parents, I don't know if it's because a lot of us and they were just prepared to lose us all, but we have a good boundary set in place. I know my dad is very overprotective and he cares and he will always ask questions. And it's just funny to see how all the other siblings answer the questions. Like, and I think my dad is just more curious to see like what we'll say. I remember he was just talking about something, and James is a very private person in general. So like when someone asks him, James, he'll just be very vague or not answer. So my dad asked us something, and I kind of looked at James, and James just looked like, I'm not answering. And I looked at my dad, and I was like, honestly, that's kind of like a personal question, and like I don't really have to give you an answer. It felt awkward saying that because all my other siblings were answering. And then after my dad left, my sibling was like, I don't know why I told our dad that. Like, it wasn't like super personal, but I feel like I realized like you don't, especially when you're married, you don't owe your parents to tell them everything again. Like, you're married. It's like between you and your husband.
Yes.
So it was just funny. She was like, why did I tell my dad everything? And I was like, I don't know. You just like, we're talking about it. She's like, it's just weird. I'm not used to just saying like, I don't want to tell you.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, that's kind of healthy, especially if your spouse is like not wanting you to share it too. Yeah. So I thought that was funny.
Yeah, that I agree with you, because the first couple times it does feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But then it's kind of like a freedom that you have in the relationship. I'm the youngest of 5 sisters, and I was with my parents the longest in the home. So I have like a different relationship with my dad where I feel open to tell him things, like when he's prying too much, or I'm very open and honest with him, and I'm like, Dad, I love you, but I report to my husband biblically. Yeah. And there hasn't been one single time where he's been upset.
Yeah,
and
it's like they understand, but I think all parents just want to know or ask questions.
Yeah. And so I think that for us, it's like we get scared, like, don't go there, don't say that. You don't want to ruin the relationship. But a lot of times it's led to more freedom, because I feel like, okay, I can have an honest relationship with you, Dad. Like, it's not something that's just surface level that, I just answer your questions or whatever. It's something that's deeper than that. So a lot of times that can actually lead to a better relationship.
Yeah. Another thing, once I got married, obviously big family, we always have so many events. And if it's not an event, it's just like, oh, family dinner and family this. And once I got married, obviously everyone likes their own freedom a little bit. Even physically, we moved further away. It's like 25 minutes away from my parents' house in the beginning, just to physically make that distance of feeling like, okay, it's a new chapter. Like, you just kind of want to be your own family. And I remembered, if I didn't attend a family event in the beginning, they were just like, are you mad at us? Did we do something? And I was like, no, like, I love our family. I'll come to like as many events as we want to, but it's kind of like, do we have to type thing?
That's so
and
relatable.
If we didn't attend, they would be like, why didn't you come? This and this. And it's like, now it got much better. And even back then, I'm like, I don't know if my dad was just giving us a hard time and joking because he was a jokester, but I'm sure deep down he was like, I just want everyone together. And I'm like, listen, you have good intentions, but like, space.
That's so relatable. Yeah.
Even not going to the same church.
Yeah.
And James is like, I get your dad though. Imagine we have kids, and what if like we're at church and our kids are at a different church, and it's like, it is what it is, though. Especially once they're married, that's their whole family. Like, you cannot force all your kids to do the same thing.
And I used to tell my parents, like, be happy that like we're close to God and we go to a church. And we have a close relationship with God. And so a lot of times, kind of talking about the opposite, in healthy families, children are encouraged to become emotionally independent in order to kind of separate in their adulthood, pursue their own goals, and become themselves and not become extensions of their parents. So I think that we might struggle with that a lot in immigrant communities.
I think so too. And it's like, how do we teach that to our kids? Because again, it would be a new thing we're teaching the new generation.
100%. Yeah, it's something that we as a first gen have to do, or if we want, we should do differently with our kids. And then opposite to that, in enmeshed families, these kinds of healthy boundaries don't really exist. Parents overshare personal information. They might not respect privacy. A lot of times, like we talked about, they can rely on their child for emotional support, and they don't really allow their children to make their own decisions and mistakes.
That's a big one.
This is a big one, and it's a big one for me.
Yeah.
Like being a mom, a lot of times now, my son, he's getting older and he's starting to do activities and stuff. It's like you want to protect them from making the mistakes, but them making the mistake and learning from it is what builds character.
That's how they grow.
Yeah, so that's a good reminder for me, for sure.
Yeah.
And then a lot of times in enmeshed families, you've talked about this, how you kind of stood out. If you express the need for boundaries, if you kind of express the need for respecting yourself or loving yourself, it's looked at or thought of as disrespectful. That's for sure. I think a big thing in the immigrant communities is like this honor culture. You have to honor your elders. But enmeshment is taking that to an extreme where it's like, okay, I can't even support my child. For me, I feel like it's a little bit different with our generation because I look at it like, okay, my parents were like, you have to go to college. We've talked about this before. Yeah. For me, I'm like, if you're following God's purpose and God's will for your life, I support you 100%. I'm happy for you. So I think that that's something that we might deal with a lot in immigrant communities is just like respect your elders. Don't talk back. Don't be, different. Don't.
It's also hard because parents want the best for their kids. But like you said, this is when it becomes too toxic and too like they really isolate you where you're not becoming your own person. And every human needs to develop that on like who they are, what they want in life. I know we talked about this in different podcasts where people are growing up, they go to college, they did everything their parents wanted to do. And then they get married and they ended up quitting their job and doing a whole different career path. And the parents are like, what happened? And it's like, I was pleasing you this whole time. And I realized I wasn't being true to myself.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's very hard for parents to see when you like push your kid in one direction. You never really gave them like a chance to like explore what you wanted to do. Even small things. I remember growing up like having hobbies. I don't think I had hobbies because I didn't have the freedom to. Or if I liked to do something, my parents were just like, why are you doing that? And I was like, I don't know, I like it. And they're like, no, like we're not doing that.
What, a leisurely activity?
Yeah, which is so funny because now my younger siblings are like in gymnastics and soccer and like painting and drawing. And I'm like, who would I have been if I had those resources and like had that support, you know?
That's so true.
So I feel like it's hard when they push this like agenda on you and then you become an adult and realize like, not did I waste my whole life, but it's, you never really had the chance to explore it. I think it's healthy for everyone to explore who they are.
I agree with you 100%.
Yeah. Well, we're going to go through the signs if you have experience in enmeshment growing up. So number one, we kind of talked about it already. There's a lack of emotional and physical boundaries. So I think that's the number one across that everyone can relate to. Number two, you don't think about what's best for you and what you want. It's always about pleasing or taking care of others.
AKA people pleasing, which we've talked about. Yeah.
That's also a big one of always wanting to make sure everyone else is happy. But
and that's if you start that cycle as a kid, as an adult, it's so hard to break.
It is hard to break. I still catch myself sometimes where I'm like, why am I doing this?
Right.
Yeah. So the next one, you feel responsible for other people's happiness and well-being. I don't know if you dealt with that. I realized.
Yeah, for sure. Especially being in a blended family, I was kind of always in the middle. So I was
keeping everyone together.
Yeah, I felt like I had to like be the peacemaker and make everybody happy.
Someone's upset, it's because something you did.
Yes. And that's why I talk about like, I feel like when I got married was such a huge time of growth for me because I literally removed myself and I was like, okay, who am I? Like I have my own family now and we'll go into that a little bit later too.
The next one is you're guilted or shamed if you want less contact.
Yes, you don't love me. I came here for you.
Yeah, which it's such a bittersweet thing because it's like, this is why I'm doing it because I love you and I want to be close to you.
And it's hard to communicate that to your parents, if they are not at a certain, I feel like not emotional level, but if they don't understand things in a certain way, it's very hard to communicate like, no, I am not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to better
our relationship.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. Your parents' self-worth seems to hinge on your success or accomplishments.
We can all take that off.
I know. Here you go. Your parents want to know everything about your life.
Yes.
This is, again, as parents, you do want to be there for your child. But I think when we say this is like on a toxic level where it's like,
yeah,
I don't know how I'm going to be yet with my kid, but when I hear parents doing like the Life 360 thing.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Yeah.
Do you know that app?
Yeah, I know what you're saying. The location.
Well, it's not it's not only location. I think location, speed limit, all these, not that it's an invade of like privacy, but it's like
you don't trust your child.
When you show that you don't trust your child, that's usually when they start being sneaky and doing what they want to do.
Yeah. So
that is, again, this is on a whole different extreme. Obviously, parents care about you, but this is like very toxic. Your parents live center around yours. Your parents don't encourage you to follow your dreams and may impose their ideas about what you should be doing.
Yes.
And you try to avoid conflicts and don't know how to say no.
Yeah, again, people pleasing.
And not wanting to like make someone upset because something that you want to do.
Yes. Yeah. So all that stuff, that's just kind of like signs. Like we said, if you experience one or all or some of these to an extreme, then you probably experienced enmeshment in your family. So we kind of talked about cultural roots and how it plays into enmeshment, and the idea of preserving your cultural roots while allowing space for personal growth can be such a struggle. And I don't really know if a lot of our parents knew how to kind of bridge that gap. And that's kind of something that we might have to do, and that's why we start to talk about it now. I was talking to a friend whose parents immigrated, and they often felt like their life decisions were influenced by their family's expectations, kind of like they were living out their parents' dreams instead of their own. Like you brought that up, even career-wise.
Yeah. I think a lot of parents, if they didn't have the opportunity to do things, they put it on their kids. And again, that's not even on immigrant families or not, but I think definitely the immigrant community, because they didn't have the same like opportunities in Romania.
Yes.
It's like, oh, I brought you here to America and you have the freedom to do this. And if you
I'm
say
working so hard for you to have these opportunities, and
like I paid for your school and this is how you repay me.
Yeah. Oh man, I'm having flashbacks.
I know. I think about it. I'm like, technically I was a teenager like 10 years ago, but especially when you're at that age, these issues are so much bigger because this is like your whole life. I remember like it would just keep me up at night, and this was like something constant on my mind. So now I'm like, thank God I don't have to deal with that anymore.
Imagine how much anxiety that leads to in teenagers that people don't talk about.
I didn't realize I was anxious about these things until I went to therapy, and I kept saying the words like, oh, I just feel bad, or I feel guilty, or I can't do this. And she's like, why not? I'm like, oh, because then he'll be upset. And she was like, that's on them if they're going to be upset.
Yeah, you can't control their reactions, only your own actions.
Yeah, which that was like a hard
pill to swallow. But it's definitely, I think, a time when you're like kind of leveling up in adulthood. When you learn that, you're like, oh shoot, now I'm an adult. Like, now I have to deal with that.
It's also hard when, I know I brought this up before, my sisters got married at a younger age. So they were out of the house quicker. I was an adult living at home. Technically, I was like up until I was 25. So from like the year like 20 to 25, for those 5 years, that was really tough because I had my career going. I felt independent, but also like trapped at home and
stuck
still
between two different.
Yeah, and it was such a weird dynamic. And I know moving out is like a cuss word.
Yeah, especially as a girl. Especially as a girl. Yeah.
And I can see both sides. I'm not going to argue about that. But I just remembered being in that like cycle of just like being a young adult, but still being with your parents, and like having that boundary was so tough. And it's like, how does that look like in a healthy way? And
for some people that might not take place until they get married or until they move out. For me, that I couldn't make that distinction until I got married and I was on my own.
Really?
And I think that physical separation kind of like was the light bulb that was like, okay, now I'm on my own, like, you know. So
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Everyone has their own time, I feel like, of when they process that. Because I talked to my sisters and they're like, oh, well, we were young when we got married and I still felt like I had to always be home and this and this. And I was like, oh, once I got married, I was like, freedom.
Yeah.
Like,
and every situation's different too, because not every parent's the same. For example, like for me, once I had kids, it was like another chapter that I went through with my mom. Not so much my dad, because I guess he's a male, like a guy, but my mom, like, so infatuated with my kids. Obviously, she's a grandma. She loves the grandkids so much. And then again, it was like, okay, like we have to implement these boundaries. And so it's always constantly learning and growing together, I think, in the relationship. That's really important.
Yeah. I kind of want to bring up, I don't personally deal with this, but I know there are families in immigrant communities when they get married, they deal with like the in-laws being that family dynamic of like, not once you get married, like this is your family now. So it's like, I feel like it's tough when you come from a healthy family and then the person you marry, their family becomes very, not controlling, but kind of very enmeshed and like, now you're married to my daughter, you have to do all these things because we're a family.
Are you talking about Phineas?
No, I actually don't know his upbringing.
That was my husband's, for sure, my husband's experience, because his family lives in Germany and his parents, they're younger than my parents. They're a little bit different in terms of, I think they were very hands-on when the kids were little, and the older they got, they kind of started being a little bit more, letting the kids be more independent. So now as adults, it's more like, okay, I'm here when you need me. It's not, but with me, like I said, I'm my mom's only daughter. So I'm really her only object of affection. So that was difficult for sure for him too. But I think that communication, and it only, like I said, it made his relationship with my mom better, mine. So that's, I think, the most important thing.
Yeah, that's good. That's a healthy way to go about that.
So also, like, just to kind of dive into the psychological aspect of it a little bit, I thought it was really interesting because while we were both writing notes on this topic, I realized that I'm currently learning about this exact theory, and it's called family systems theory, and it's a theory that was created by a super renowned American psychologist, Murray Bowen. He basically coined the theory emotional fusion, which is another word for enmeshment, and it basically just means that a family member's emotional boundaries are blurred and thoughts and feelings tend to become mutually shared. And that's kind of what you touched on when you said that your therapist talked about how everybody needs to have the same thought. And I think it's called groupthink.
Yeah.
How everybody needs to feel the same. So actually, Bowen believes that fusion can occur when parents over-identify with their children and they share their emotional experiences and emotions. And then a lot of times fusion can also happen when a child anxiously responds to a parent's emotional cues and starts to adjust their behaviors and thoughts and feelings to keep the parent emotionally regulated. So in other words, it's like you're putting your child through something that's like way above their pay grade. Like they're too little to deal with those kinds of emotions.
Yeah. It's like a big responsibility that's not theirs to carry.
Yes.
Oh, it's like a tightrope between honoring the unity of the family and giving everyone room to breathe and grow as individuals.
Yes.
So how can immigrant families find that balance?
So I think, like we touched on, first and foremost, open communication is key. Whatever that may look like, open communication, if it's just asking your parent one question and opening the door to this discussion, I think that families need to have space where they can voice their thoughts and concerns without the fear of disappointing or alienating their loved ones. And sometimes you might disappoint, but you might disappoint the first and the second and the third time. I know that's how it was for me. And then the fourth time, it's like, okay, I respect my daughter. I respect her boundaries.
And I think it shows when you keep bringing up the same concerns, like, okay, this is actually bothering her. We should probably take this more serious, because I feel like parents dismiss a lot of things.
Stand your ground. Yeah, for sure. Stand your ground with things that are important to you. If your relationship with your parent is important, then you need to stand your ground, because like we said, it only leads to healthier relationships in the end.
Yeah, when I would bring up these conversations to my dad, he'd always be like, why does this have to be so difficult? Why are you asking all these questions? And I was like, if I didn't care, I literally would not ask you.
100%.
But like, I'm actually bringing up these concerns. I'm super anxious even talking about this with you. Like, I mentally prepared myself for months to even bring up this like one sentence that like, clearly it means a lot. And this is why I'm bringing it up to you. And I think with that, I don't think I would have gotten there without the help of therapy. I feel like with therapy, it helped me kind of just reassure, like, okay, these are my thoughts and I feel this way because of this. And it kind of gave me the confidence to know and like to stand my ground, because I feel like before I would bring up something to my dad and he would ask me a question and I would just be like, okay, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
like,
whatever,
maybe.
brush it off.
Yeah, and then I would never bring it up again because I'm like,
you'd be scared or anxious.
Yeah, or I was just like, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, or like,
so it reassured you more.
It reassured me more, and it made me, I'm a very logical person. So once I knew why I was feeling the way I was, and there was actually background info, and that's why I loved when she was like, oh, this is enmeshment. I'm like, I knew there was a word for like how I'm feeling. It made me feel more confident. I know I talked about this on like another episode of therapy. In the beginning, my parents were like, why are you going to therapy? And I kept going, and I feel like my parents saw the goodness and like the fruit it brought, that they also started respecting me, and they're like, okay, you're doing this to better yourself. You're not just doing this to, I don't know why they thought I would do this to like, who knows?
Yeah,
in a bad
love
way.
That. I like so much what you said about how you asking the questions meant that you cared, that you wanted better, that you wanted to have like such a good relationship with your dad. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. We don't do this to harm our parents or anybody else. We don't set boundaries, but we do it for the good of the relationship and also for our own mental health, because you cannot live life like that, like in that type of, and it's too toxic to be so enmeshed, especially like you said, when you get married and you have a spouse. You need to learn how to differentiate and set up those boundaries, I think.
Yeah, I also think it's hard for our parents to understand that, because I see how their parents were, and it's like they're such a close family, as in like everyone's always around each other.
100%. Yes.
But the older I got, I don't know if there's a word for this, maybe you know, but like just because you see someone every single day and you're close doesn't mean you're actually close with them. And that was like a weird thing to me. And that was like how they viewed if you were close to them or not. And I was like, that
physically, if you're
like
physically
just because
close.
you're physically always seeing someone doesn't mean you're close to them.
Right.
And then they would like disown you if you were never coming around. So I feel like that was always an interesting thing to see.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that was just like the older generation of like, this is how we show each other we care for each other.
I think that plays, I just had like a light bulb moment. I think that plays so much into how they were. A lot of our parents' generation in Romania, they lived with their parents. So here in America, it's not really socially acceptable for you to live with your parents. Like your parents more go in homes when they're older, but in Romania, I think that was just a given. You got married, your parents lived with you, you took care of them until they passed away.
It's like a generational housing.
Yeah, and they were like you said, physically under the same roof. So for them, it's like, what do you mean you won't even pick up the phone like to answer, you know? So just that kind of mindset shift, it's a cultural thing. Like here, you know, it's hard for them to understand. We're living here in an American culture. As much as we want to keep our, you know, cultural roots, and we try and we do, there's certain things that you just can't get around.
I know. And I also think just because you guys did that back then doesn't mean it technically was a good thing.
Yes.
That was the norm.
And that probably led to a lot of marital strife and a lot of issues, you know, between husband and wife. I don't know. I love my parents and I love my husband's parents, but I don't know if I could live my whole life under the same roof.
Yeah. I think physical boundaries is healthy for both parties.
Yeah. And it's also just really important to remember that change takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. And it's a collective effort. I take one step, my parent might take one step, and that way we get to kind of a common ground. It's a journey that's worth taking. Like I said, when I first got married almost 8 years ago, such a different relationship than I have now with my mom, like night and day. I don't think I would have thought that I would have such a good relationship.
Don't you feel relieved?
Yes, relieved, and just like truly have a good, close relationship. And I'm so happy, because doesn't everybody kind of want that, to have that kind of a good relationship with their parents?
Oh, for sure. Especially when you get older and you have grandkids.
Yeah.
It's funny because when I was still living at home, my older sisters that were married were like, trust me, I don't know why once you just get married, it becomes so much easier. And they would always say, like, once you get married, you're not going to have issues like this. And I don't think it's the marriage part that changes you. I think it's literally you physically
removing yourself.
Yeah, like being away for a little. I think that's what like shows that boundary line. And maybe getting married just because it shows that you're like in a different family now. But it just sucks when you're in the midst. Like if you're listening in the middle, and you're like
A
not
teenager.
even dating someone, and like I know a lot of girls are like, I just can't get, like, I can't wait to get married to get out the house, and I'm like, no, like, don't marry to get out the house.
Yes,
that's dangerous.
You're just causing a whole other set of problems.
So I remembered it was like hard to not have that thinking and just being like, no, like when I get married, it's going to be the right timing. I'm not going to force it. So I remember that was a thing that everyone would always be like, oh, I just can't wait to get married so I can get out the house. I'm like, don't get married just to get out the house. It definitely helps once you get married and like you have those boundaries. But I remembered like how you said yours was 8 years ago. Mine was only a few years ago, but I'm like, thank God where I'm at now. I never thought I would have like peace of mind and clarity.
Yeah.
And
So there's that hope
feeling
too.
independence. Yeah. There's definitely hope. But I think it does start with setting boundaries. I think we're similar. We didn't just like ride the motions and let whatever happened to us. We like we stood firm and we're like, no, this is how I want my life to look like.
So now let's kind of get to the good stuff and let's talk about tips for untangling the enmeshment that we may experience in our immigrant families.
Yeah, tip number 1, start the conversation. Create an environment where each family member can express their individual desires and dreams without judgment.
Yes.
Like trying not to laugh because I'm picturing my family do this. Like, I know it's tough. Like this tip sounds so easy, but it's hard getting there.
Yeah.
Tip number 2, educate yourself and your family about the concept of enmeshment. Sometimes understanding where these feelings come from can make them easier to address.
And like you said, pinpointing like the actual term and the word helped you to kind of feel like, okay, I'm not crazy. This is something real that I'm experiencing.
Yeah. And other people experience it too. It's you're not alone in this. It's there's thousands of families that deal with this. Tip number 3, encourage independence. It's also important to honor your cultural heritage, but also allow space for personal growth and exploration.
100%.
Tip number 4, seek professional help. Therapists experienced in family dynamics can provide guidance on establishing healthier boundaries and improving communication.
Yes.
Which I'm all for.
Yes.
I remember once you create boundaries, my therapist was like, do you feel better? And I was like, yeah, 100%. And she's like, not that it was a negative thing. She's like, well, your situation didn't change. It was literally your mindset that changed.
Wow, that's huge.
And that was kind of cool though, because I was like, that is true.
love
I'm
it.
literally in the same like circumstance, but how I think about things and it protected me. I didn't feel like anxious and overwhelmed anymore. So
I love that. Yeah.
You know why I love therapy now. It helped me so much. And then finally, the last tip is be patient. Untangling enmeshment is a process that takes time. Don't rush it, and every small step counts.
Yes, like we said, I take one step, my parent might take one step, and you meet in the middle. So there you have it, guys. We hope that these tips serve as guideposts for those of you that are navigating the super complex tapestry that is enmeshment and immigrant families. Once again, don't feel like you're alone. We've dealt with it, and we just wanted to kind of have this episode as education to kind of tell you guys that it's real and to not feel crazy about it. Remember, each thread in the fabric of your family is so unique and it deserves its own space to shine. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. Until next time, keep weaving connections while embracing the beauty of your own individuality.